Concussions. Everyone has heard the word several times in their life, or experienced, either firsthand or through someone else, the effects of one. Head injuries like concussions are becoming a growing problem in the world of sports, and more is being done to prevent these detrimental injuries. However, not everyone is aware of the problems multiple or even just one concussion can pose to our nation's youngest and even most seasoned athletes. The sports where talks of head injuries and rule changes to protect athletes most commonly arise in hockey, football, and soccer. This is due to the high probability of high-speed contact in each of these sports. Today, however, I'm going to be examining the rise of concussions in the sport of football, more specifically at the collegiate and professional level, where technique is supposed to be the highest. Slowly, the awareness for head injuries has grown, particularly in the game of American football, and have become a subject of deep concern, much study, and even congressional hearings in the United States. The question I pose is, what has caused the dramatic rise of head injuries in the last decade or two in football at the collegiate and professional levels? I believe the reason for the aforementioned question is a combination of a few things: overall awareness of concussions, the increase in size and speed of the players, and the evolution of the game itself. Let's start with a little anatomy lesson and some common misconceptions surrounding concussions. Every year there are more than 300,000 sport-related concussions reported, and the true value is likely much higher due to athletes withholding from reporting symptoms to coaches or trainers. The problem is that there are few evidence-based studies that can help define and manage concussions. But recently, a consensus statement has been created by a panel of international experts called the Prague Guidelines and have given a formal definition. They have defined concussion as a complex pathophysiological process affecting the brain induced by traumatic biomechanical forces which, 1, are caused by a direct blow to the head or neck or somewhere else on the body with an impulsive force transmitted to the head, 2, typically result in the rapid onset of transient impairment of neurologic function, 3, may result in neuropathologic changes, but these changes are largely a functional disturbance rather than a structural injury. Thus, concussion is associated with grossly normal neuroimaging studies. Or 4, may result in a graded set of clinical syndromes that may or may not involve loss of consciousness. Resolution of symptoms usually follows a typical course. Now, what does all this medical jargon mean? Basically that, contrary to popular belief, a concussion is not a bruise to the brain caused by hitting a hard surface, but rather a biological change at the cellular level. In a nutshell, the rapid acceleration and deceleration of the head causes the brain to crash against the walls of the skull and disturb the delicate brain cells. They respond by releasing chemicals that stimulate neighboring cells, which in turn release more stimulatory chemicals. The result is waves of chaotic activity that disrupt communications among cells for weeks. The symptoms that arise from the change in chemical activity are dizziness, headache, confusion, nausea, slowed response rates, and attention deficits. Hence, a player that suffers a concussion becomes around 4 times more likely to sustain a second one. Clearly, a lot goes into the study of the brain and what happens to it during a concussion. But why do players, coaches, and athletic trainers need to be worried about concussions past the week or 2-week recovery time? What are the long-term threats? Before 2009, the NFL had denied reliable data linking concussions to brain issues of ex-players later in life. Then, a study commissioned by the NFL reported that Alzheimer's disease or similar memory-related diseases appear to have been diagnosed in the league's former players vastly more often than in the national population. In addition, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, states that repeat concussions can result in brain swelling, permanent brain damage, or even be fatal. Another long-term effect that has emerged is the degenerative disease chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. Not much is known about this disease thus far, but what is known is that 90% of confirmed cases have been in retired athletes, and those that have a history of multiple concussions have a higher incidence of dementia and dementia-related diseases later in life. The risk for football players who play with a concussion is becoming more and more clear, and they place the safety of arguably the most important organ in the body on the line. This risk is why the NCAA and NFL are stepping in to make new legislation on managing concussions and trying to remove dangerous hits from football. I could spend several more minutes discussing the science of the brain and steps that the NFL and NCAA has taken to cut down on head injuries. However, that is not what this essay is geared towards. The first, and quite possibly the most significant reason as to why head injuries have increased in football is simply awareness of head injuries. In years past, there was no such thing as accelerometers and sensors placed in football helmets to record the number and severity of collisions to the head. However, in recent years, scientists have conducted numerous experiments that involve that very technology. One such experiment was documented by a doctor from the University of North Carolina, in which he used a relatively new device that turns any helmet or protective headgear into a head impact monitor. The head impact telemetry system, or HIT system, was used to record the number of hits to the head a starter in college football might experience throughout each season. The study concluded that between 850 to 1,050 hits to the head are suffered by an average college football player. The data from this study and other studies alike go into re-engineering of new football helmets, and each year every helmet company comes out with a new technology or design that is supposed to reduce concussions and head injuries. But is that really the case? Researchers from Case Western Reserve University conducted extensive tests to pit the old-fashioned leather helmets against today's high-tech models. The results were stunning. According to one of the researchers, Dr. Brian Wasson, the leather helmets back in the day were more compliant, and the forces could be diffused into the leather and work with the forces, as opposed to today's helmets that resist the forces and leave more room for the head to snap back and forth, which is known to cause just as many concussions as straight-on impact. Our new age technology may actually be working against football players. Compared to decade-old models, today's helmets are huge, weighing anywhere from 6 to 8 pounds. That's a lot of weight being put on the neck muscles when gravity takes over. And when two players wearing these things run into each other full speed, that's just asking for trouble. Despite all the scientific factors going into increasing the effectiveness of protective equipment, an increase in reported incidents can still be seen as a good thing. That means that, yes, concussions may be increasing every year because the game and its equipment are changing, but it also means that all of the concussion awareness programs are simply doing their job. The next factor to influence an increase in concussions in football is the increase of the size and speed of the players themselves. Greg Easterbrook, a popular columnist for ESPN, analyzed this very issue, although not in the context of head injuries. He used the example of ex-NFL star and member of both the College Football and Pro Football Hall of Fame, Randy White, who played defensive tackle at 257 pounds. Although a master of the technical aspect of the position, White probably wouldn't even make an NFL roster today. Defensive tackles nowadays average well over 300 pounds, and that's not all fat. This goes for all interior linemen and linebackers. According to acclaimed NFL analyst Mel Kiper's stringent bookkeeping of NFL-bound players coming out of the draft since 1979, linemen on both sides of the ball have grown on average anywhere from 1 to 2 inches and have put on nearly 60 pounds on average. Today's players are stronger too. The best test to determine a player's functional strength is to see how many times they can put up 225 pounds. This difference is most significant among linemen, but the trend still appears for skill position players, just on a smaller scale. Mel Kiper also states that generally the speed of the players, based on the 40-yard dash times, have not changed. This is where I disagree. Kiper argues that Deion Sanders and Barry Sanders were among the fastest players ever, and they both came out of college in 1989. Although the electronic timer debuted a year later, which was still started by a person pressing a button, This was still the era of the hand-timed 40-yard dashes. So what? The difference can't be that significant. Track and field officials already have a correction factor for human error from hand time compared to electronic time, which is 0.24 seconds. So why not football? Researchers at Truman State University thought so too and conducted a study comparing hand-timed 40-yard dashes versus full electronic timing, meaning the timing started and ended electronically. They concluded that a correction factor of 0.16 seconds be used, and in the 40-yard dash, that is huge. This means that if a player runs a 40-yard dash in 4.4 seconds, he actually ran it in 4.56 seconds, which in many cases can be the difference between a game-breaking 70-yard run and a gain of maybe 6 yards. Credit for the development of these superior athletes over the years is also largely due to improvements in nutrition and health science and the emphasis of athletic apparel companies on making the athlete lighter, faster, and stronger, all at the same time. What results is pretty obvious, and one does not need a physics equation to figure this one out. Two bodies with more mass and more speed will generate much more force, and that difference pays dividends when it's their heads that are on the collision course. Lastly, and most often overlooked, is a change in the game itself. Anyone who knows football can talk about how the game has changed from a primarily in-your-face, smash-mouth type offense to a more finesse, spread-em-out, run-and-gun type offense. For those who don't understand, the game of football has slowly evolved from a running game to see who is tougher, to a spread-out passing game where the goal is to see which team can outrun and out-strategize the other. From those statements alone, however, one could deduce that the older style football would cause more concussions. This is false. With teams now using formations that have anywhere from 3 to 5 wide receivers, defenses now have to put more faster athletes in the game to cover the wide receivers. This also means that the defense has to give these fast receivers room off the ball so they don't run by them. And now what you get is a spread out field where players can get a running start before trying to level their opponent, as opposed to both teams crowding the ball and having where the strongest, fastest players are no more than 5 yards apart from each other. Those type of open field hits have been a cause for much concern over the last couple of years due to the amount of concussions and head trauma they cause. But seeing hits like that is what Americans love to see, so they will continue to be run on the highlight reels. The conclusion may not be as clear for this argument compared to the previous two, but nevertheless is just as important. Not only are today's football players bigger, faster, stronger, wearing larger helmets and lighter equipment, but are now sprinting across the field at full speed in a myriad of confusing patterns while chasing down an oval-shaped piece of cowhide, flying through the air at upwards of 65 miles per hour, and having defenders sprinting equally fast at them trying to hit them as hard as they possibly can. Hence, I believe it is sufficiently clear as to why concussions are increasing in all levels of football. Is there any possible way to get rid of this trend without losing the appealing aspect of football? Probably not. Adding more and more rules and, in effect, wussifying the game of football will only disgruntle both fans and players as they watch one of America's favorite sports turn into a penalty-ridden game of touch rather than a battle on the gridiron. While I agree that head injuries and their aftermath are very serious and must be limited, I also feel that the best way to help this issue is simply awareness and having coaches and players understand that getting their bell rung is no laughing matter.
My work ethic speaks for itself. 25-8.